would put it on record also, although this goes into YouTube, so I don't normally need to put it on record, but just in case. So thank you, Tat. First of all, it's always a pleasure talking to you. That's back, of course. And we've spoken quite a bit in that show. So definitely we've spoken, and it's nice to hear your views. And on this issue, definitely we need your inputs. I mean, this with your vast experience. And of course, you're looking at it from the global perspective. So that's going to be a very good thing. So after this, you have to introduce yourself. This is your presentation. I'm out of it, which is very rare. You know that. I'm not going to come in, but I'll come in at the end. I mean, whenever you ask me to come in, we'll have our conversation. Yep. So I'm going mute, and this is your show now.
Thank you, Vikram. Always so nice to see you. Wish we had more time in the course of the time we've had together, but I'm always grateful to be able to get on board and speak with you and the many people that you brought on both this channel as well and in all the previous sessions you've facilitated and organized. Well, first of all, want to say greetings to everyone who's watching this, now in the future. A very warm welcome from sunny Singapore. It is today slightly rainy, but those of you who have been to the tropics and been to Singapore, you know that we have very warm and humid weather all year round. And today is no different, except that today is a weekend, so everyone's a bit more chill. My name is Lim Tat. The Westerners call me Tat Lim because my surname is Lim. And back home, friends and people who know me well, they call me Tat. So Tat is actually my name. I've only got one name, and my surname is Lim. I'm happy to be here today to continue this series that Vikram has so meaningfully organized to share what I think might be useful takeaways in terms of traditions and culture of how mediation is done in Singapore. And part of me thinks that when I say done in Singapore, probably Singapore tends to encapsulate you could say, a microcosm of the practices of, say, mediation practice in the countries around us as well. Singapore tends to be a melting pot of ideas. That's how we've thrived. And I think it's no different from mediation, that when the journey first started more than 20 years ago, the stakeholders and the decision makers who deliberately brought mediation in a structured way into dispute resolution processes in Singapore considered the Western model, but very quickly also considered how that can be contextualized to Asia. I'm going to help myself by sharing maybe some slides just to give those of us who are visual learners something to look at and absorb. But mainly, I hope that the takeaway, it would be more like a conversation. I know it's like a one-way because this is a recorded conversation. But I'm very happy if after this conversation or when some of you who are tuning in and watching this, if you think it's useful to bring this conversation further, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I really look forward to seeing as many of you connecting with me into the future. So with that, let me share what are some of the maybe takeaways that I would be putting forward in today's discussion. I plan to not go on for longer than 45 minutes, and if I can end earlier, I will, because knowing how fatigue sets in when you're listening to this on the internet and on YouTube, it's important that I try and compact what I'm going to share with you, and hopefully it'll become more lively when I tell you maybe some stories to enhance or support the experiences that I'm going to share with you. The topic is actually about Singapore's culture and traditions, right, in mediation, but I think the starting point would be my own anecdotal experiences, because I think each of us in practice bring our own background to the work that we do. My own background is, I would say, not really exceptional in terms of growing up. And some of these slides I've shared in previous forums, and those of you who may have seen it, you might want to take a closer look then, because in some of the other forums, I would have gone pretty fast through some of this. My own mediation experience started while I was very much still a litigation lawyer. And it is in that vein that I decided, when mediation became available in the work that I do as a litigation lawyer, that I found it was surprisingly very comfortable to me, very organic, I would say, to me, in the sense that very quickly I became very comfortable with the idea of discussing a resolution of a dispute which is being litigated. And it seems to resonate very nicely with my impression of how disputes should be resolved. Instead of going to a forum like a court or an arbitral tribunal where the answer is always going to be binary, someone wins, someone loses, and the way in which the dispute is going to be resolved is always going to be centered on very fixed criteria, right? Very fixed methods that's based on the rules, either of court or the arbitral tribunal, and also depending very largely again on a decision maker. That's not to say that the decision makers are no good, but often one cannot possibly bring the entire background and nuance of the dispute, the background relationships, the important things that make up a dispute to a forum like the court and the arbitration. So I find mediation becoming very quickly something a process which aligns to my view of how disputes should rightfully be resolved. So along the way, I became very interested and I started learning a lot more, and I make it a point to reach out, learn from as many people as I can. I think that's really the only way that we can become better at what we do. So some of the initial pictures now that I'm going to show you are interactions of people who are very dear to me. And I've had, I would say I've been very privileged to be able to meet some of these giants across the world. My IBA Mediation Committee family, I like to call them that, have been a wonderful source of encouragement and companionship in this mediation journey. Those of you who are mediators out there listening, and you know that it's sometimes a very lonely journey, right? And particularly for those of you who are still practicing as lawyers, as counsel, you also know that mediation is a fantastic process, but somehow or other, it takes so much energy to even just bring the message across and invite people to, try the process. And the work that we do is a very lonely kind of work, right? Unlike court or arbitration, where if you're sitting there as a judge or an arbitrator, people are compelled to listen to you, right? Because at the end, they want you to rule in their favor. Whereas the mediator has no such role, right? The mediator's role is really to try and get parties to be comfortable with him, develop that rapport, and create an environment and an ideal environment where people use the neutral to resolve their problems in a amicable, collaborative way. So the work we do sometimes can be very draining. So I'm very encouraged and happy for the mediation family that I have, one of which important piece is the IBA Mediation Committee family. This is one of the kind of presentations that we do in the IBA forum, where you can see I'm seated there based on my screen, the right of the screen. And seated on my right is my dear co-chair at that point in time, Gary Binberg from the US. And on his right is Jill, who was one of the previous co-chairs of the IBA Mediation Committee. And here we are, I think in Montreal, presenting about the Singapore Convention and presenting to an arbitration crowd, really, at an arbitration breakfast on why mediation is important even to arbitration and arbitration practitioners. Here's another picture of, again, members of the IBA Mediation Committee, when we were all together in 2019 August in Singapore. just soaking in the ceremony of the signing of the Singapore Convention. Lovely times. My extended family also includes people, very renowned practitioners. I mean, these are people I really look up to from the International Academy of Mediators. And here in the picture, of course, is Hale Abramson. And those of you who have read his books know that he's a prolific writer and a wonderful professor who teaches about mediation, but also about mediation advocacy, right? How lawyers can become better mediation advocates in the work that they do in mediation. Someone that everyone in the mediation world should know, one of the co-authors of Getting to Yes book. Again, this is one of the conferences organized by IAM. It's a wonderful opportunity, like I say, to meet giants who have been so influential to the work that negotiators and mediators. So I'm so privileged to meet and learn from many of these people. My dearest family in the Weinstein International Foundation, I was very privileged and honored to be selected to be a fellow of the of GEM Weinstein Foundation Fellowship. And every year they select a group of people worldwide. And my time came, and 2017 was just a wonderful period of learning and sharing from the fellows who came together. And we had a very good time in San Francisco, just learning from the guru, or I should say gurus. Danny Weinstein is in the photo itself, and he's been one of the most influential person in the lives of the fellows, including myself. Here's another picture of what fellows do. We learn, we go out and interact together, fellowship, encourage one another in our journeys. Our journeys, interestingly, are we come from across different parts of the world. And in this photo, you will see some of us who hail from South America, some from North America, myself from Asia, and we all get together just to fellowship, share our journey, and by the way, encourage each other on best practices and how we can move our practice along. Nadia Alexandra and Greg Bond, two of the people I really admire and look up to. And here we are in an international mediation competition. And these are lovely competitions where the next generation of negotiators and mediators are nurtured. And again, so privileged to have been working alongside with people like Greg and Nadia in the work that we do in these competitions, where we judge, train, and coach the next generation of student mediators and negotiators. Closer to home now, and next two photographs are photographs of my family here back home, mediation family back home, in the Society of Mediation Professionals. And this is a society that was conceived and started to cater to mediation practitioners in Singapore and outside Singapore. It's to provide a, you could say a platform, but also a grouping where as mediation practitioners, whether you're a lawyer or non-lawyer, whether you're a mediator or someone who's a mediation counselor or coach or advocate, to come together and just to share our stories and learn from each other. And here we are having Chinese tea, not ceremony, but it's one of those lovely sessions where you go through what would you call this? It's kind of like a little ritual where you make your Chinese tea and then you share it with everyone and then you tell stories in the meantime. Here's a more traditional picture of, again, with my SMP colleagues, where we sit and after a meeting just to eat. I mean, Singaporeans, if you know us, we always talk about food and drinks. So this is again one picture where you can see we are partaking in something that just comes very naturally. We all like to eat, and there's lots of great food here. So to those of you out there listening in, a shout out to you. Come and visit Singapore and look me up, and I'll be the first to bring you out and have a drink and what we call makan here. And this shout out to you is to you, Vikram, as well. Last but not least, this picture. This picture is very dear to me. I think it signifies, in a way, the coming to age of my mediation practice. Two of my dearest friends in the mediation family, Jeff Sharp, Bill Wood, both so extremely accomplished in the work that they do as mediators. And for them to be willing to collaborate with me is something that I find, really treasure. And I feel very humbled that they would reach out and say, why don't we start a mediation practice together? I think to me was my turning point as well in many respects, because this to me was a very tangible way of saying, I've come to a stage in my professional practice where I am now also a civil and commercial mediator, having a firm that practices solely in mediation. So that was a very important step in my journey in this coming to age of my mediation practice. So that was a quick kind of snapshot of my mediation journey background. And it does lead me to this point where I get to share a little bit about traditions and culture of Singapore's model of mediation. I mentioned earlier on in the beginning that Singapore is like a melting pot of ideas. And I think no different from mediation, because when we first brought mediation, I like to say back to Singapore, because Singapore being part of Asia has always, I think, the way disputes are resolved in the community, within families, and even within the more structured landscape of dispute resolution, I think has always featured direct negotiations and mediation. But it's just that I think about perhaps almost 20 or 30 years ago, when mediations was formally brought back into the court system of dispute resolution, that it became more widely known to lawyers as a formal way in which you can resolve disputes other than through litigation. That mediation offers a route that you can take to resolve disputes without the matter going, full-blown into trial, and maybe even before you start your litigation. This presentation I made really to IAM some time ago, but I wanted to say that whatever I'm telling you really is from the context of the work that I do. I continue to still practice as a counsel, as a lawyer, but increasingly I do more work also as a mediator, but it's from my own personal perspective. And the context is always going to be anecdotal. I don't pretend that I've done a widespread objective survey to be able to bring these thoughts to you. So everything that I tell you really is based on my own experiences. And I probably would say that maybe my experiences would be reflective of some of the mediators and practitioners based in Singapore. But by no means I think it will reflect the full experiences or background of the people who practice alongside me in Singapore. And the focus of my talk would be probably more on commercial disputes rather than community disputes or neighborhood disputes. The spectrum of disputes mediated in Singapore are now very widespread, because ever since mediation has become mainstream, you find that through the encouragement of the judiciary and the government in Singapore, disputes are now put on tracks where the first port of call is usually mediation. And then moving into the court system, you also find that the courts are increasingly putting forward practice directions, guidelines, and even in the forthcoming changes in the rules of court, being in a position for the courts to order people to move into collaborative processes before they formally file their litigation in court, their cases in court, right? I mentioned specifically litigated cases, family and commercial, because in the last maybe 5 or odd years, family cases has in particular become very widely, moving towards a collaborative form of dispute resolution. Indeed, the buzzword now in family justice is therapeutic justice. The idea that the justice that is presented or achieved in family cases is one that provides therapy to couples in distress. And commercial cases, of course, have that track where the encouragement is always going to be, please go to mediation, because that's where you might find your own solutions without having it imposed on you by a judge. Small claims and schemes are now lots of mediation happening in that space. So these are the two areas that maybe I'll be focusing more of my presentation on. Here's a little spectrum of the institutions in Singapore that you'd find are entrenched in the mediation landscape. And for a country of our size, so small that we are, you find that there's so many institutions that are involved in mediation, or that encourage mediation, or that have schemes that facilitate mediation. And my own involvement in this whole meridian, this is not exhaustive, by the way, this little table, but I have been involved in cases in the institutions which I've highlighted in red. Again, but for purpose of this morning little talk, I'm just going to focus mainly perhaps on the data which is available to me on those three areas which are highlighted in yellow. When you think about commercial mediation in Singapore, you'll find that we've had very good success in our settlement rates. And so you find that the mediation of state courts, which are, sometimes what we call court annex mediation, right? That mediation of the litigated cases that commences in the state courts, they are being mediated by judicial officers and some volunteers. People like me volunteer, and also many of my friends, both lawyers and non-lawyers, some of them volunteer as mediators in the state courts. And the success or settlement rate of the state courts mediation is extremely high. 87% is a very, very good rate. In the Singapore Mediation Center, SMC's mediation of Supreme Court cases, well, not necessarily just Supreme Court, but mainly Supreme Court cases, you find that over the years, the settlement rate has consistently been above 70%. And what is really interesting in the data is that 90% of this settlement, settled cases of 70% are all achieved within 1 day, a one-day mediation. So consider how powerful this is in terms of the data that suggests you can resolve a dispute in 1 day, saving so much time, cost, stress, angst through the process of mediation. SIMC, the Singapore International Mediation Center, is a fairly new institution in Singapore, but even as a new institution, you'll find that they've achieved very good success. I mean, 170 cases, I think, is nothing to miff about, given that, they've just come on stream just for a couple of years. But also, SIMC has started to create waves, not just in Singapore, but around the region, where they've collaborated with mediation centers in Japan and Korea, and in other places that are developing mediation, their own mediation landscape. So moving away now from the Singapore institutions and having a look at the profile of mediators that we have here in Singapore and the kind of cases that we have. You'll find that maybe because of the influence that we've received from the Western model. When I say Western model, in my mind, I'm referring to the model that is traditionally taught in Harvard Law School or Harvard PON, but also the kind of causes that you find run in not just US, but maybe UK as well, and the established territories like Australia as well, Australia, New Zealand, and in that light, maybe Hong Kong as well, that most mediators start their journey by attending we call it a 40-hour mediation course, but I think now there's some debate whether it should be 40 hours or more. But Singapore Mediation Center is an established institution that has organized mediation courses for a long time. And people tend to start their journey in Singapore attending those courses, passing the assessment, and then either volunteering or asking to be selected for empanelment so that maybe they will start receiving some cases. Some mediators like myself, we start to cut our teeth by volunteering to be mediators in various places. Like I started my journey as a mediator doing some work for the state courts, then called the Subordinate Court Center for Dispute Resolution, or PDRC. And then some of us shadow more established mediators, or we co-mediate with others so that we can learn from each other. So that tends to be the journey of most new mediators when they start out in Singapore. The Singapore Mediation Center panel has, well, right now, 85, and you find again that the majority of the mediators are lawyers. I'm not sure whether this is the same in the jurisdictions that you practice, those of you who are tuning in. But it seems to me that in the common law world, lawyers, I think, have always played a role in being the go-to, right, for people with disputes, especially commercial disputes. They see a lawyer, and then the lawyer helps to advise them and helps them to think over the dispute, and maybe also helps to advise them on their case theory and how they can move towards a dispute resolution process. So most of the 85, as you will see, are lawyers, but there are increasingly a number of non-lawyers like doctors, accountants, who are trained mediators, and I say very good at what they do. Almost the entire panel, most of us are Singaporeans, but there's also a panel of international mediators. I suppose maybe the reason is historical, because SMC, when they first started off, of course, would be training the locals, and as they bring us on board the panel, the majority of us would be Singaporeans. Majority of us in the SMC panel are not full-time mediators. In other words, we have our day job as well. And for those of us who are lawyers, we continue to practice as lawyers. Doctors continue to do so, and so on and so forth, right? Many may not receive more than 1 or 2 paid appointments annually. And so when you look at our developing mediation landscape, the challenge has been, for some of us who are invested in this landscape, the question becomes, how can we bring on more cases to the mediators so that they have more ability, more chances, opportunities to practice, and therefore gain more experience. And this is a continuing conversation. I think part of the challenge here in the Singapore mediation landscape is that earlier on, when I mentioned that the state courts have court annex mediations, that is a scheme, a service that the state courts provide, where the mediators are almost free. So if you go to the State Courts Center for Dispute Resolution, if your claim is up to 60,000, you will find that the mediator that's provided and the mediation process provided by the court is free. You don't have to pay the state courts or the mediator money or fees to participate in that mediation. In the district court, which the jurisdiction is up to 250,000, you might pay a fee, but I believe that the fee payable is quite modest, maybe $300 or $400. So that if those cases are released by the state courts, you will find that then, of course, probably there'll be a lot more opportunities for mediators to have more cases to mediate. But I believe that may be one of the reasons why there seems to still be not enough cases for the majority of trained mediators to receive more than 1 or 2 paid appointments annually. And many of these paid appointments are co-mediation opportunities. So where do most of these cases come from? And when I say cases, I mean commercial cases, right? They tend to enter the mediation process through litigation. And as I mentioned earlier, the majority of these cases are in the state courts, where there is court annex mediation. The higher valued cases tend to be mediated through SMC, SIMC, or through ad hoc. I think the reason for this is because the gatekeepers for these higher valued commercial cases, they tend to be either lawyers or in-house legal, where when you have cases that are high valued or very commercially sensitive or intensive, you might be very considered about picking a specific mediator rather than asking the institution. So that might be also the reason why you find these cases tend to be channeled through a ad hoc mediation where people want a specific mediator to mediate the case. This really segues to some of the points raised in this slide, that most mediators are actually chosen by lawyers, not clients. And most lawyers in Singapore regard subject matter expertise as being important. There's a lot of discussion about subject matter expertise and process expertise. I mean, my own personal view is I think it's more important in selecting a mediator to have a mediator who's a process expert rather than a subject matter expert. But I accept the point held by some practitioners that in certain cases, subject matter expertise may be important so that you do not necessarily have to explain a great deal about the background of the dispute and the nuances for those kinds of disputes. Again, seniority seems to be important, and I think this is a piece that may not be just limited to the practice or custom in Singapore. But here's a piece that may be quite nuanced to Singapore, that in Singapore, judges, both active judges and retired judges, can be mediators, and in fact are preferred choices for some users. Naturally, cost is important. Those are important considerations. Here's a sampling of what it might cost to mediate a typical commercial dispute. You have first tranche and the lawyer's cost, right? And typically, I think you'll find that in Singapore, for a normal commercial dispute that is litigated in a high court, a lawyer's fees to represent the client in a one-day mediation may cost maybe between, depending on the size of the firm, the seniority of the lawyer, between $20,000 Sing dollars to maybe even more than 40,000 Sing dollars. The second cost that you would incur in mediating a typical litigated commercial case in Singapore would be the institution's cost. This tends not to be as high, and you see some numbers that I put there. For one-day mediation, Singapore Mediation's case management fees is about 4,500. And this is divided by the number of parties. If you do want to have your mediation administered or held in Maxwell Chambers, where I'm actually seated at Maxwell Chambers Suites, yeah? My office is located here. So the building on my left, there's another building there. It's Maxwell Chambers, and they have lots of rooms, and it's a very popular location for arbitration and mediation. And the charges for one room and two small rooms is about $3,000. So you find that this cost do rack up. The last cost is of course the mediators fees, and you find there's a wide range. Some mediators will not charge as much, maybe between 5,000 to 10,000, but you will find that some commercial mediators do charge more than 15,000, 20,000 for just a one-day mediation. So mediation has become, in some cases, not inexpensive. You find that sometimes the mediator's costs can be quite costly, and that's something I think surely as mediation practitioners we have to be mindful about, that it doesn't become so prohibitive that people find it maybe more affordable to just let the court take care of your dispute, or let arbitration be the default to get a resolution of your dispute. What has happened since last year, February, when COVID affected everyone here, is that I have found and learned from my friends from overseas that Zoom mediation has become a big thing. Well, either Zoom or online mediation. And it seems to me like learning from my friends in the US particularly, many of the mediators I know now mediate exclusively through online, and they will not mediate face-to-face mediation. The experience here in Singapore, I think, is really quite different, that most people I know here in Singapore, lawyers and clients, still prefer face-to-face mediation. And if there's a choice between online and face-to-face, especially where travel is not a problem, I think you continue to see that the mediations here in Singapore will continue to be either face-to-face or hybrid, where some people will come in online, but there will be others who will be attending in person. I think part of the reason why this is so is something I was sharing with Vikram earlier on, that we have a very high vaccination rate here in Singapore. And maybe because of that, there is a sense of maybe assurance and safety among people who live here, that if you are vaccinated, fully vaccinated, and you take the precautions like wearing a mask and doing a bit of physical distancing in your mediation, you should be fine. This little chart here also shows the percentage of mediation based on age group. And in particular, you find that in the light gray line, close to the 80% mark, the 60 to 69-year-old range is particularly high. In fact, the more senior grouping of people residing in Singapore, many of us have received our full 2-dose vaccinations, either Pfizer or Moderna. Culture of mediation. Well, it's not useful to talk about culture of mediation without, I think, you, the listener, having an idea of what constitute the population, people living here. So this is a snapshot, right, that out of 5.6 million people here on our little island, you have about 4 million, I should say about 3.5 million Singapore citizens, and non-residents and PR comprise the rest. Here's also a snapshot of what may be important from a cultural perspective. 33% who are Buddhist, 18% Christian, 18% equally about same percentage of Muslim, and then the rest either being Taoist or free thinkers, no religion, or some other religion. So fairly wide spectrum of different faiths that we have. And so one of the key, I think, in Singapore's success has been that regardless of your race, religion, you believe in you believe in a life philosophy that you are going to live together and not let these things be a source of conflict among all of us who live in Singapore. So that, I think, has been one of the critical things that has contributed towards Singapore's success as an island nation. Singapore's ethnic composition still remains largely, majority of people here are ethnic Chinese, and then you have 13% who are Malays, and then a slightly smaller percentage who are Indians. But I will say this, that although this graph seems to reflect a dichotomy of different ethnic groups, being someone who was born and raised here, I would say my mindset, and I think I would say that the mindset of my friends who have grown up here, we've never regarded this ethnic division as something that's important. And I think part of that is because, especially for us guys, we all go into national service together, regardless of your race or your educational level. At 18 years old, they pack you up, you go into national service and you serve in the national service together. They shave off your hand. After that, you all look the same, right? Because you're in the sun, and if you are in the sun together, you all get dark very quickly and everyone looks the same. So I think partly because of the melting pot that we've had in our joint experiences in national service, that's really created the harmony of the racial groups together. So I don't see the people that I've come to know and grown to know very well during my national service days, or even in my school days, as people from, a different culture, a different race. I regard them as Singaporeans. And the race does not even feature in my consideration. So looking around at how those kinds of issues may result in very deep-seated disputes in certain parts of the world, I am indeed very grateful that the founding fathers of Singapore looked at this and came up with solutions to create at least that balance of harmony where we can live our lives together. So I'm very grateful for that. But that's part, I think, of the culture of Singapore that contributes towards the landscape of mediation. Some of this data I'm pulling out, really, they're not my data, of course. They are data which are either presented or researched by people out there who do this work, or by the Singapore, there's a Singapore institute that does statistics, so that would come from them. Back home, you'll see that the largest grouping of language is either Mandarin or English. I don't find that surprising because historically, when I was growing up, you will find that the schools, you would find either English educated or English medium or Chinese medium. And so for some of us who attend the Chinese medium schools, your language of teaching that you're taught would be in Mandarin. So your proficiency might be in Mandarin, but also not surprising because when you look back at ethnic Chinese, we tend to grow up, in my time, speaking to our parents, our grandparents in our own dialect group. Most of us in Singapore who are Chinese, we come from various dialectal group. I think the largest dialect group may be Hokkien, Teochew, Hainanese, Hakka. So those dialect groups tend to then speak in their own dialect at home. But some years ago, I think this must have been more than 30, 40 years ago, the Prime Minister then of Singapore decided that the way forward was for everyone to learn a common Chinese language, and Mandarin was chosen. So that might be the reason why language most frequently spoken at home, if it's Chinese language, is actually Mandarin. And then the rest of us who come from English educated schools probably speak to our parents, and hence English 32%. Back to, again, the landscape of mediation, right? So when you go to mediation in Singapore, you find that those mediators who are judges, either still sitting judges or retired judges, the convention here is to address them by Judge so and so, right? And not Mr. or Miss. So that there's a sense of reverence or deference given to them, respect. Majority of our mediations are conducted in English, and where there's a need for interpretation, sometimes lawyers will provide interpretation, or sometimes we'll bring an interpreter. The paradigms that we have here are such that some institutions would require co-mediation so that people get more experience. There's a large pool of mediators who want to gain more experience. Co-mediation offers an opportunity to have two in each mediation and giving more than just the one person experience. Online mediation, Zoom is, I think, almost exclusively preferred. And most lawyers tend to prefer a one-day mediation, even if you have to work past the midnight hour just to get it resolved. I mean, it's interesting because if you look at the mediation landscape here, sometimes you ask a practitioner, well, how did the mediation go? And the storyline sometimes becomes, how long has it gone? And it's like sometimes people wear like a badge of honor if they're able to say, you know what, it went on to 3 a.m., 4 a.m. in the morning. I know that's sort of controversial in some ways, because in some other places, the learning has been that you shouldn't pressurize people. When people are exhausted and tired, you should let them rest, take a break, come back another day, right? But over here, I think a lot of us believe that, when the iron is, strike while the iron is hot, and when it's really hot, try and get the deal done, and then sign off and go home. A lot of mediations here are also carried out under the shadow of the law, so that the discussions at mediation during the joint sessions are often includes a debate on the merits of the law. And sometimes that has to be managed properly so that it doesn't become or look like submissions to the court, right? Because it's not a forum where the mediator is going to be able to judge who's right, who's wrong anyway. Some of the interesting methods of mediation or techniques of mediation that I've seen in the mediations that I've shadowed, particularly in California, are not repeated here. So bracketing and mediator's proposal are not very widely or popularly used here. I move away from that now and drill in a little bit more into the theme of culture, right? The Singapore model of mediation. So why is it that, those characteristics of mediation that I presented just before this, is there a reason for that? If you look at culture, one of the learnings that I've had over the years is that Gerhard Hofstede has offered a lot of learning for me. And when I consider his 6 dimensions and present it in towards looking at that from a prism of Hofstede's 6 dimension and asking the question, what are the characteristics of a Singaporean negotiator or mediator using those 6 dimensions? You find that this is the result. Comparing the blue Singapore, a Singapore person, to a purple, which is someone who's living or practicing in UK, and then someone in green practicing in UK. I mean, notably, you will see some of the blue lines are very different from the purple and the green line. So let's unpack that a little bit more, right? In terms of PDA, right, Power Distance Index, Singapore is high on that front. And so, broadly speaking, I think you'll find that the culture here is that Singaporeans do accept that all individuals in society are not equal and power is distributed unequally. And that may also be the result of the deference given in mediation to either a judge or to someone who is a senior practitioner. Individualism is low for Singapore in this dimension. So it points towards Singapore or confirms that Singapore is a largely collectivist society. The we is important. Face saving in mediation is often a piece that's very important. Masculinity is right in the center, but I think we tend to be more on the feminine side. So concepts or ideas such as consensus, agreement, sympathy, being modest and humble is seen as important. We have a low uncertainty index, which means we are comfortable with ambiguity, right, and uncertainty. Now, when you go and look at this in Hofstede's website, you will find that he says this, that it's not because of the low uncertainty index that Singaporeans have many rules and they abide by those rules, but he says that it's because Singaporeans are a high-structured society. I think I would be probably correct to say a lot of us are like type A personality. And probably Vikram can say that of me as well, a type A personality. But because of that, we have many rules and we abide by those rules. There's always a bumper sticker, right? That Singapore is a fine society, F-I-N-E. So that you come here, if you inadvertently throw your sweet wrapper on the floor and you happen to get caught, you might get fined. If you are chewing your gum and you inadvertently stick your gum in a place and you get caught, well, you might find yourself being fined as well. Long-term orientation, Singapore's high on that front. This is where our cultural qualities includes perseverance, sustained effort, slow results. Singaporeans tend to believe that the combination of efforts may produce something better. The right and wrong, I'm not sure whether it's that features by virtue of this dimension, whether we see things very differently from the Westerners. But the next dimension, indulgence, I think it's probably true that we are probably more on the restraint side as a society. We are not as indulgent in terms of self-gratification, although I'm not sure whether my reflection is that of someone from the older generation, because certainly when I look at my children, I'm not sure whether this is true as well for the younger generation. So that is a conceptual, I think, deep dive on the Hofstede 6 dimension of the Singapore person. But next, we want to look quickly at a mediation process, Singapore style. And, this might be good for those of you who have been mediating for some time to just compare what Singapore-style commercial mediation look like. Typically, client goes to a lawyer will issue written demands, and then sometimes litigation will commence because that's usually the default port of call. And then when do parties consider mediation? So this is a graphic chart top-down of the litigation process, probably very unexceptional and not unusual to those of you who are common lawyers, right? Who are lawyers who practice in a common law jurisdiction. I've put these arrows to say that there's a whole myriad of discussion on when would be an ideal stage in the process of litigation where mediation should take place. Should it be right at the start before you commence your litigation, somewhere further down the journey, or right after you have obtained a judgment or after an appeal has been heard? And the majority or consensus of most senior practitioners tends to be that somewhere in the center, after you have had discovery and before trial, before perhaps even the parties have prepared their affidavits of evidence in chief. And if you do get into a mediation process in Singapore for a litigated commercial case, what would that look like? It tends to be split into maybe a pre-mediation process, mediation itself, and then a post-mediation. This is a graph which is probably not unusual to everyone listening in, right? The diamond-shaped model of a typical mediation process, right? We sometimes define the upper side of the diamond shape as a problem-defining process and the lower part as the problem-solving. When you look at this theoretical process, it might look like this of a Singapore mediation, right? The early hours, you have your introductions, and then parties will open their statements. The mediator summarizes agenda setting, joint exploration, going to private caucus, and so on and so forth until you reach your agreement. So start at 9, maybe by 5 o'clock, you sign your agreement. But the actual process that we practice in Singapore actually looks very different from that, right? Because you will find that leaving aside pre-mediation, which is what this slide is about, and pre-mediation has now become very important for some of us who practice this very, in a very structured, considered way. We like to see the parties beforehand, learn more about the case from the lawyers, and get a sense of where are the impasse, the compaction points. What are the things we need to talk about? What are party sensitivities, right? These are some of the things which I think all mediators find very helpful. So this is becoming more and more practice now in Singapore. But this is the actual day of mediation. And you see, compare this with your jurisdiction, how you practice, and compare this with the theoretical model that I brought up earlier. What does it look like? So the meet and greet in the morning is fine, right? We tend to start about 9:30, maybe a bit later sometimes, but we start by usually just meeting each party separately. And then, everyone will come to the same room, and then the mediator will start our introduction, and then we'll invite parties to speak. In Singapore, the lawyers tend to speak more, and sometimes the clients may not want to speak. I don't think the reluctance is because they are afraid of the mediator, but sometimes I think there's a notion that if you're represented by lawyers, well, then let the lawyers speak because they know the case better and they can articulate better, maybe. But in certain cases, I've been able to encourage parties to ask their clients to speak, particularly in cases that contains a high component of a relationship factor, particularly family disputes, for example, or family disputes with family members, many family members. It's important to hear their voices, I think. But this tends to then give way to a little break, and then the mediator will hold private caucus. Lunchtime takes place. Usually, sometimes we work through lunch. And then after lunch, you'll find that the real negotiation takes place. And then through the afternoon, to me, as a commercial mediator, the afternoon flies by very quickly because there's a lot of active negotiation carrying on. And the 5 o'clock mark is sometimes where we use to gauge stock take. The 5 o'clock mark is where you then, as a mediator, intuitively consider, do we think we're going to get a settlement or not? And sometimes there's a sinking feeling at 5 that, oh dear, parties are very far apart. Are we going to be able to do this? But then it often leads to greater encouragement to the parties and a revived energy to bring parties together so that your settlement finally takes place or shape at the 6, 7 o'clock mark. And you think that's all fine and good, right? Because, you finally reach an in-principle agreement. But as all of us who have done this commercial mediations especially know, it is just the end of the beginning, right? And it's now the beginning of drafting the agreement, which can take forever sometimes, because the lawyers start wordsmithing, putting terms, boilerplates in. And that's where it's not unusual. Sometimes you have an in-principle agreement at, say, 7, 8 o'clock, and you don't sign the agreement till post-midnight. And so that's how the mediation process looks like in Singapore. And 90% of the 70% settlement cases follow this process like this. So this is very much now almost like an established tradition, if you like, of commercial mediations in Singapore. So which brings me to the question, so what's so distinctive about Singapore mediation? Is there a distinctive feature, right? And I'm just going to quickly walk through what I think might be distinguishing features. I'm going to be helped and assisted by a speech which made in 2002 by the then Singapore Chief Justice Yong Pang Hao. This was in the early days of mediation in Singapore, but he was already saying that the necessity to infuse Asian perspective into the Western transplanted generic model of mediation. Right? And he gave 3 examples of how this can work or how this is important. The first is the concept of face. How face is, at least in the Asian, and I suppose Chinese, but also in Asia, generally in Asia, is a psychological image that can be granted, lost, fought for, or presented as a gift. And it's important, I think, to grasp this concept for a mediator, because sometimes, so often, the dispute, which is narrated as a money claim, has its roots in not a money claim at all, but on a reputational issue that is rooted in the Asian concept of face. Right? So that's so important. Second example he gave was the high value that we place on the interests of the community. So, for example, Confucianism, right? Teachers want to be a good person, but beyond that, teachers want to think broadly or in a collectivist principle, thinking about, your family, your community, your country before yourself. And then thirdly, the notion that people expect the mediator to be, I think in Singapore, more interventionist, right? Don't just facilitate the dispute, help us resolve our dispute. I think Singaporeans, as well as lawyers here, regard the mediator as someone who they would expect to be a conciliator more than just a facilitator. And so the statistic borne out in SMC survey show that people opine that they had mediators who actually suggest options and who assisted in evaluation or who actually evaluated the merits of the case. And certainly nobody took umbrage with those conduct or practices of the mediators. In fact, the examples that were cited by Chief Justice Yong suggested that people were happy when mediators offered guidance on the substantive matters. And something I mentioned earlier, that the data suggests that Asian context mediators assume a more interventionist role than that of a facilitator. And although this particular these three examples were brought in 2002 by the then Chief Justice of Singapore, I think if you look at the latest data and survey done by the Singapore Institute of Dispute Resolution Academy, SIDRA, you will find that the theme seems to be similar, that by now, more sophisticated users of mediation services in Singapore have that same expectations of their mediators in Singapore. I'm coming to the end of the presentation. So it's important when I talk about traditions and custom to also provide at least some framework of where mediation sits in legal framework in Singapore. So well, over the last few years in particular, all of us around the world would be familiar when you're plugged into the mediation space on the signing of the Singapore Convention of Mediation in 2019, right? And that came into force 2020 in Singapore, being a ratifying state, in fact, the first ratifying state of the Singapore Convention. But 3 years prior to that, we already have our domestic legislation, the Singapore Mediation Act. But you will find that even prior to that, our subsidiary legislation and regulations have already provided the landscape, the infrastructure to encourage lawyers and users of courts to move into ADR, particularly mediation. Some of the case law we've had have also been very encouraging, moving parties towards a mindset shift that way back 2012, one of the earliest cases that dealt with ADR term provision in the contract made the statement very clearly pronouncement that contractual term requiring mediation is enforceable. And in a fairly recent case where a party that had signed a mediated settlement agreement tried to set aside that settlement in the court by a claim that she felt pressurized to sign the agreement because the mediators had engaged in reality testing. The court in that case, Justice Tan Siong Tai said that no, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it is right for mediators to inform and educate parties about mediation being a lower cost alternative compared to court litigation. So you'll find that these are examples of the kind of landscape that we now have in Singapore. Very well supported mediation by the judges of the Supreme Court. And in fact, even in the state courts, especially, some of the judges themselves mediate disputes. So this brings me to looking at the crystal ball to the future, right? That when you look at how our mediation is likely to develop in Singapore and how this may influence a rethinking of by maybe around the world mediation institutions, we now have proposals by our civil justice reform into amendments. It's not actually, I would say amendments, but they are really a wholesale review of a brand new set of rules of court. And in right now, what's called the Chapter 3, there is a duty to consider before the commencement of an action and during the action itself, the idea of considering amicable resolution of the dispute. And the duty, notice the word duty, to make offers of amicable resolution before commencing action, unless there's reasonable grounds for the disputant not to do so. You also find that in this same chapter, which will become eventually the rules of court, there is a mandatory requirement to make an offer of amicable resolution, and that it's not just making any kind of offer, it must be an offer that is reasonable in its terms. And if you've not discharged those duties that I mentioned earlier in Rule 1 or in Chapter 1, you then find that the court may actually order the parties to attempt to resolve the dispute other than by litigation. And this might mean the court ordering the parties to go and participate in mediation. So I think the landscape in Singapore looks like we are going to evolve even more towards making sure parties consider and participate in mediation in the commercial and civil cases landscape. So the final slide that I have is in relation to, of course, the Singapore Convention. As at the time of this slide, I think it says 4th September, not too long ago this year, 54 countries signed, 7 countries have ratified. And there's been much discussed about the Singapore Convention. My own sense of the Singapore Convention is I think it is a game changer. It might take some time for it to be ratified by enough large countries so that it becomes a tipping point for people to consider mediation as the default first port of call before they even consider arbitration or mediation. But I think that time is slowly going to come very, very surely. It's almost like when I first started practice, the default dispute resolution landscape was litigation. But as a young lawyer, we were told that when you're drafting agreements, put an arbitration clause, because there are very good reasons why. And in those days, when I first started my journey, we all started learning about the New York Convention and the advantages of arbitration compared to litigation, right? Fast, quick, can be relatively cheaper. And I mean, of course, some of those characteristics have unfortunately been diluted because of the way in which arbitration seems to have moved towards a very much rule-based process, and become so much more expensive than I think the process was first envisaged when it came onto the scene. But looking at the trajectory of arbitration when I first started practice, we were told to plant clauses, arbitration agreements within the agreements you drafted, so that parties are bound to arbitrate. And I think that was, I would say, one of the reasons why that led to the success of SIC, the Singapore International Arbitration Center, because parties are then committed, right, to arbitrate at the SIC. And over the years, SIC has been receiving the benefit, I think, of all the seeds that we've planted for arbitration. And so when you segue that thought into mediation, those of us, I think, who are able to influence this, perhaps we should start planting a multi-tiered dispute resolution clause where mediation is planted as a first port of call for disputes. And slowly, I think, but surely, when you plant those seeds, when they start to germinate, more and more, the scene will shift towards mediation as the first port of call. But I'd like to end with pictures and photographs, of course, and I'm not sure, Vikram, whether you eat a lot of this back home. This is, of course, the durian, right? And a fruit that you either love or you hate, I think. I brought some friends of mine from elsewhere, Americans, and people from elsewhere. When they taste this fruit, they kind of either recall because the taste is so powerful and the effect is so strong, or they kind of like it. I mean, the most generous comment I've had was, yeah, it's not bad. It tastes a bit like custard, but once a lifetime, it's good enough. But mediation, I think sometimes is a little bit like this. It's a very powerful tool, but it's a very unique tool. And the more you uncover it, I think the more you become cognitive, aware of its flavors. And it's a very strong, powerful, unique flavor that in the light of dispute resolution, I think is a very important piece to, I would say, save and enhance the practice of arbitration and litigation. I'll say that again, that mediation really would help to expand the practice of those of you who are more inclined to practice litigation and arbitration, because it's like a stool with three legs, right? Mediation is one of those legs that will enhance the spectrum of dispute resolution, and together with the other two processes offers a wide spectrum of ways for parties to resolve their dispute. And really on that note, I've taken a bit more time than I really wanted to, but I hope that gives everyone who had a chance to listen in a whole spectrum of the traditions and culture of the mediation landscape in Singapore, seen through my eyes as a mediation practitioner. So on that note, I'm going to stop talking and hand this back to Vikram.
Thank you very much, Tat. Look, it was expected that it's going to be a very nice presentation. And only problem I found in the whole thing was that you misled us right from the beginning. That I don't know. I did not expect that from you. Okay. First of all, I mean, how, first of all, can you say that on a weekend you are chilled? Singaporeans are never chilled. So you just that was wrong on your part. I mean, you can't fool people around the world. Then you say that look me up. 2 months back, I fixed a time for you, which was earlier. You could not make that. And you're asking us to come and see you. How will you give time to us? And when will you give time to us? Please clarify.
Well, I think to the second question, when I had to call Vikram and say, I'm so sorry, the time you allocated for me, I can't do. It's because of, again, part of the reason is when we sometimes get a case as a mediator, it's told to us with short notice. And that particular case came to me at about the 4 p.m. mark of the day before I was due to present. And Vikram said, but you promised me 2 months ago. And I said, I'm so sorry, but I almost always yield to a case in mediation just to see if I can be of help to them, especially when the parties reach out to me. I find that it's very hard for me to say no. So I apologize to Vikram and to those of you who might be expecting me to show up yesterday, or in fact, the day before yesterday.
Because what you don't understand, what is important is, like you said, I'm doing it for mediation. It's a mediation, but you don't understand you have a larger role in terms of mediation. There are so many people who have to hear you. That message that you have with your vast experience needs to go out. So
Yeah,
let me also tell you, from October, I'm starting a lecture series, and you have to obviously find that time to do that. Now we'll do it at your convenience. Now it's not a day related thing.
mm,
It can happen anyway. I've understood that it's a YouTube thing now. So people are going to watch it at their convenience. So we'll do it whenever you have time, but this needs to go out. Your vast experience needs to go out. The
you're
other
very
thing you have to
kind,
clear,
Vikram.
I mean, come off it. God, I don't even have to say this. Your message has to go out. But what you also have to clarify is that Maxwell Chambers has not sponsored this. I don't get
Yeah.
anything from Maxwell Chambers at
Yeah,
all.
that's absolutely right. So neither Maxwell Chambers, which I'm not associated to, I'm just a tenant in their chamber suite, nor Maxwell Mediators, which is my practice together with Bill Wood and Jeff Sharp. No, we have not sponsored this at all. But I am in deep awe at the time and commitment of Vikram to bring the mediation community together and allow this platform for all of us to share together.
Yeah, because I have the larger thing that I want to do. So this is part of that. And you are part of it. I mean, on the larger thing also, it's not just this. The other thing you have to also misled us that you're going to take 45 minutes. How can you take 45?
Oh.
I would not have let you take 45 minutes. So, I mean, these are things you don't say. You cannot say this. It's not going to happen. The
Yeah.
other thing is, oh, yeah.
I wanted to take 45 minutes, truth be told, but when I was moving through the slides, I decided that maybe it's not fair for those of you who have decided to tune in, that I decide to then truncate and limit the presentation, because you might find something interesting or useful from some of the information that I presented during the course of probably the 1 hour, 10 minutes.
Well, I think maybe what I've understood is a lot of you, I mean, you included, and all these wonderful people all over the world don't realize what you are giving in your value addition to people's lives. You don't understand that. Maybe you take it for granted, which is why I said that lecture series is important, because all that you have learned and everything, people need it. You don't take you, it's part of you. You just doing it, and as you've learned and everything, but that experience and everything has to go out to the, even, I mean, hey, younger, not just younger people, everyone. So I think it's really important, because 45 minutes with you is nothing. But now, yeah, you're saying something. I cut you off. Okay.
No, no, I accept what you say, and I have myself been the beneficiary of so many people's time and the effort they've given. So I'm totally with you.
Yeah. But what you have to also start with, because this is something that I've seen over so many, because like I said, I sit in all of them. I mean, you people will watch it as time goes by. I've sat in all of them. So colonization for everywhere has been one reason for traditional dispute resolution to go. Now, in terms of traditional aspect of dispute resolution, being in that area, I mean, Singapore obviously as a country came in later, but that whole territory and that region, did you find anything there in traditional dispute resolution?
Traditional dispute resolution, I think that the narrative and the storyline has always been, when you go back, there is always a figurehead in every family. And in the larger community where you have extended families, there always would be a patriarch who is the person who you listen to. And when he says this, you listen to him. He resolves disputes that way. The traditional sort of environment in Singapore, when you think back when we were probably in the 19th century or before that, has been community living in villages, right? Before we became so urbanized. And I know from reading that in those times, there would be a head of a village, like a Temenggung, who adjudicates disputes. And the way it's done is through conventional wisdom of the community head. And so I don't think that's unusual, but my sense of it is that going back to that sort of idea, people may regard a mediator, especially in our community disputes, how it's resolved today is there are grassroots leaders who perform that role, and people would go and listen to the grassroots leader and have their disputes mediated. In certain cases, it is very evaluative. The community mediator would listen to the disputes and say, look, you need to do this, you need to do that. And they would say, right, thank you so much. And they'll go away and try and resolve their disputes that way.
But in that sense, it has society changed? That I mean, in terms of respect for elders and these community leaders, has that changed as a generation that you've grown up and has?
I think it has changed in that people are maybe less receptive now of being told what an answer is, what the solution is. It could be because the educational level, by and large, of Singaporeans and people living here have gone up. So they start to think more for themselves. I mentioned collectivist society, but again, that's just a general sort of portrayal. I find that individually, a lot of us may also be very individualistic in the way we see outlook on life and resolution of disputes. So I think the society has changed. And so I think when a mediator steps into the scene and tries to assist parties, I think that's a piece which you have to be very mindful about, that it's not in every case that you can just step in and say, here's what I think about how you should resolve your disputes.
Yeah, because what has come up, and interestingly, what has come up, like you said, that even in the traditional system, we do say that mediation happened, but they were told what to do.
Yeah,
so that's one thing that has come up. But interestingly, some people are working on this. So I mean, yesterday there was person from Kenya. James is working on this.
yeah.
He's gone into communities in Africa, in East Africa, and he's actually in some way sensitized them to say that, look, this is maybe not the way to go about it. So they're also giving them the general, as we call it, the modern method of mediation. So he's trying to get that, and the power imbalances, how to balance it. So he's doing that with the communities to do that. On the other end, there is David Shimoni, who's worked with Jews who came in from the Balkans into Israel. And there he's formulating this hybrid model that the traditional and the modern mediator come together. Will there be resistance? Maybe, as obviously the traditional method and the rabbi saying that you have to do this, and you tell the rabbi and maybe you should not do this. How that works out, we'll see. But at least interestingly, people are working on this, and I feel that that is important. If we have to in some way take it down to communities, because look, a large population in places it is rural population. Because you're sitting on one end, you're sitting on the institutional and that high-end commercial. But for me, mediation is something that has to go all over. So for me, that is really important. And I felt this hybrid concept that David Shimoni came up with and James' work, I think we need to take that further up. And I'm saying you might be part of this system, but you are important to take this in other places, because you can bring that experience there. So we will not say that, yes, you're part of that and you stay there. Don't do that.
Yeah, I mean, in response to what you just said, I agree it's important to share certain models that we learn and we are used to. But I mean, in the work that I do at the, I am also a mediator with the Compliance Advisory Ombudsman that's part of the IFC World Bank Group. And the kind of disputes that we mediate are not like the commercial disputes, right? They are what is experienced by a community, social, environmental disputes, which when they feel affected by developments ongoing funded by, let's say, a World Bank, those kinds of disputes, I think, warrant a very different treatment. But I think is important for mediators to realize is you have to listen very hard and be very aware of what you're bringing into a community, because it's not like just transplanting a model and say it's worked in the US for how long, and therefore there's no reason why it can't work in a particular country. My learning has been that use that as a framework, but be very open to how you need to contextualize that in the landscape that you are operating within. So there's a lot more, I think, probably that needs to be learned in how that would work in, David's work, as well as I think you said James' work as well, right? But I would be delighted to hear their stories and see how far they've gone and what are the challenges they face and how they've overcome those challenges. Lots of learning there as well.
Because what I'm doing is I'm trying to make this action group of people who have looking at traditional systems. There's a Christian from Romania. He's worked in Crete with the community there to understand how they go about it in this whole traditional system. Very interesting. You must read that and
Mhm.
watch his episode also. But you
Yep.
must also watch on the other end what Louis Ore in Peru is doing. So
Mm.
exactly what you said in the World Bank situation where communities are affected. So in mining projects, so what they've done in
Yeah.
on a very large scale, so
Mm.
he have this, I mean, you might have a stadium full of people, but
Yeah.
there the hybrid model in the sense that physically might be there, but you might have government
Mm.
officials available online on the screen, or he also might be somewhere and the community might be somewhere else. So, I mean, very interesting work is happening there, which I think needs to be again taken up in other parts of the world. But of course, you've raised something which for me, I will have to go through it. You said something that has worked in the US. I'm saying it hasn't even worked in the US because in
Okay.
40, 45 years, you must have
Yes.
heard if you see any of my sessions, I always keep saying in 40, 45 years, if mediator is not your first port of call, there definitely something has gone wrong. If you have to, well, one, you said lawyers have taken control. So lawyers take it to the courts, and from the courts it goes to mediation, and it could be ADR. They say 90% gets settled by ADR. They don't say mediation. So I don't have that figure on mediation there. But just the
Mm.
fact that it has to take that route, there is definitely fundamentally some issue. And what that issue is, we'll come out with as we go along, because the statistics that I have on community mediation centers, say 400 community mediation centers, 400,000 matters in the entire country. Can you
Wow.
imagine?
Yeah.
Chile. I mean, we have someone, Jimena from Chile. She's saying that many to they are looking at in Chile. I mean,
Yeah.
imagine. So there is some fundamental issue somewhere. Is the other vested interest not to let it develop in community level? I mean, I am going to open that, keep that question open. I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
saying that it is, but we have to keep telling people that models might look all right from the outside, but you must dig a little deeper, because you don't want a society where 100 million cases are filed in a 300 million population. Our
Yeah.
country like ours be finished. If 400 million matters go into courts, that'll be the end. Already it's an issue. And after
Yeah.
that, what are we going to do? So I think maybe that route has to be relooked and how it's going, because Jeff Kechavan has started criticizing it. And when Jeff takes something up, he's going to go all around and talk about it. So he's coming on the last day, and let's take this up with him, because
Yeah. Sure.
people say he's controversial, but I think he's picking up things which are important. But
Yeah.
from the Singapore perspective, the whole concept of court structure, because you'll have to take us through this aspect, that why the court system, because I question that itself. Okay, I mean, I
Mm.
will talk about that. But why the court system? And from that end, what is the situation in Singapore in terms of the colonial laws? Because we have
Mm.
still retained the civil procedure code that the British gave us,
Mm.
1908. You, I
Mm.
know, have the same penal code that
Mm.
the British
Yes.
gave us. So
Yes.
those reforms are not happening. What is the reason behind it, and how are we going to take that forward?
Yeah, well, but the towards the end, I mentioned that we are moving away now from the rules of court which we inherited from England, and the new rules, if I can call it that, looks so different, different nomenclatures, and I think watch that space because it's going to come on stream very quickly towards the end of the year, if not early next year. And when that comes, I think we can have a debate because it will be the start of something very different. Maybe I was going to say very Singaporean, but it might be even very Asian, moving away from those concepts of common law with brand new languages and maybe brand new jurisprudence on that front.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we need, because I'm telling you, maybe we're not going into the root of the problem. And
Yeah.
if that justice delivery system becomes more efficient, because Chuck, who's from Israel but based in Germany, he's gone into this research. What I mean, he's looked at statistics that in Germany you don't have too much mediation because the court system is very efficient. while in
Yeah.
Israel it's not. So definitely it leads to more mediation. So I think the root of the problem solution is not what the courts are doing to send into mediation, because I will tell you, have to give your thoughts on this, but my concept is that because you are not being able to deliver justice, because justice delayed is justice denied. I keep
Mm.
saying this, I will repeat it here also, that there should be a board outside the courts to say that we deny justice. Because in countries like ours, I mean, I can't say how many years it takes there, but in countries like that, it has to be put across. Now, in such a situation, if you are going to force people to go for mediation, now it's kind of become forced because you are inefficient. And like this whole colonial concept that the courts are up there and no one can question you, you are in most inefficient institution, because you can't keep people in jail for more time than they would have spent if they were convicted on the first day. I mean,
Mm.
it's not what you do. There is
Mm.
some issue there. I mean, you have to solve that. So, but
Mm.
to send people onto a process which is so opposite of the court system. And now people have started saying that mediation is access to justice. I just have not been able to understand that. People resolving their disputes with them within themselves, they have access to justice. I don't think
Mm.
the concept of justice as what is required to be dispensed. Maybe there is, maybe I have got it wrong, but I still feel that they're putting into a direction which suits them because
Mm.
they're inefficient and they can't do it. Because I'm totally against the court system. One, because of the fact that the private practice hasn't developed. I to even say private mediation. I look, you'll hear this a lot of time, but I have to put it across. The concept mediation was supposed to be private. That's the way it was supposed to be. It was not supposed to be part of the court system. But we
Mm.
have to use private mediation, that word, because the court system has developed. So
Mm.
I think that aspect of it, look, my issue is that Constanza in Brazil, I was talking to her, she said, in my lifetime, I want to see a situation when I can only do my private practice. Can you
Mm.
imagine that seriousness?
Mm.
And I mean, that kind and court system as is that developed in these countries. I know we've seen a mediator in India started with some lawyers, a private mediation center. The court started a mediation center. He had to close it down. So I'm
Mm.
just thinking that how are we going to get over this? Because for me, look, focus is, I'm still calling it private mediation. I don't want to call it private mediation. I want people to develop that, because there's such wonderful people who are stuck in litigation
Mm.
because they can't have a full-time practice of mediation. And I'm telling you, for a person like me, I could not do it. For me,
Mm.
that process, it's a mindset thing. I can't do it. So for
Yeah.
me, this is my only practice. But
Mm.
every time a free mediation is done in a court, you're affecting my livelihood. You might have matters in the courts, and your senior lawyers running mediation centers, and you're charging huge fees in the courts. But for me, this is my livelihood, and so many more who can take it up. So
Yeah.
that issue is there. And so I've been looking at also the fact that why should the fees of a mediator also in a court system, supposing you have a court system, why do you want to regulate it to an effect it becomes free?
Mm.
While in the courts, you start a litigation center and give the lawyers the same fees or make them do it free. Will they ever do it? It's another process of dispute resolution part. You want to make it part of the court system, then balance it out. Let that also be free. So
Mm.
I'm just saying, what would your thoughts be on that? Because I'm a little passionate about it, or whatever word you want to use. I have an
It,
issue there.
it's been an ongoing debate here for a long time. I think in the beginning, it's easy to understand from a matter of public policy that you want to allow people with the smaller value cases, the lower value cases, to have access to mediation. So from a starting point, it doesn't look like a bad policy, right? So offer mediation free once they get into the court system, and the settlement rates are high. So it achieves both the entry into mediation and resolution of disputes without incurring costs. Taxpayers, of course, end up paying for the process and the work done, but it is something that maybe was very helpful in the beginning. But I feel like for Singapore, we've gone so far off now that maybe we should start weaning some of these cases off the almost free court mediation service and let them come out to the open market where the value of that process can truly be unlocked, and then it can generate the expertise required by mediators who can then take that on board and perform that role with the true value that it commands. So I agree with you, but I think it's a conversation that needs to be had with many different stakeholders. because it's larger than just, I think, the piece of the mediators. It's got to do with also, I think, the judiciary, and in my country, probably the Ministry of Law as well.
Look, you can't be that vocal because of the fact that obviously it's part of the court system also. Otherwise, I'm very vocal about this. I said that India-Singapore summit and the chief justices of both countries came together.
Yeah.
And the fact they're talking about mediation. For me, I am saying, why should the judiciary be talking about mediation? They should be talking about how we can dispense justice faster, what procedural laws have to be changed, where are we on the same thing, on the civil procedure code, all these issues, those reforms. Can we increase the number? Why are the number of judges not increased the way caseload has come in? Is there politics behind it? Should we be looking at that? I mean, those discussions, I don't see if you, I can imagine 1908, 2021, if you are still sticking to something and on the same time you form a committee to look at drafting a mediation law, you're putting pressure on the government to do something because you have a self-interest in it. Should you be pushing? Because look, you have a value. Chief Justice putting a committee and giving a certain suggestions is I am saying you're trying to influence the whole thing for your self-interest. So I just feel that these are things that need to be discussed, and I am the right person to do it. I mean, not wanting you to get you into any controversial thing. So I'm not asking you to say something. I'm putting it across to you just as a thought, maybe somewhere in line when you have discussions with people who are policy makers and all, please bring this up, that are we still living in that whole colonial mindset that the courts have to be involved in every dispute resolution concept? No, dispute resolution in the court system is one part of dispute resolution. Dispute resolution has to happen in various other ways. So why are you wanting to be part of it? Is that colonial mindset that it is us who have to do it? New concept of pre-litigation mediation word is used. Are you saying every time there is a dispute resolution and if the settlement doesn't happen, it has to go for litigation? Aren't there other ways of dispute resolution before that? So many ways of dispute resolution are there. I don't even want to name them because I'll limit them. So to even use that, I'm saying there's so much focus, the concept that we are still stuck in that world. I think that part of it also needs to be put across. Look, yes, it happened. There was a colonial concept, but we need to move on from there. It can't go on. So that, I mean, I find that, but from your slides, one thing that I want to, I mean, an observation, you said that in terms of Indian languages, only 4% are spoken. Population is 9%. We are losing out somewhere. Our cultural identity is being lost somewhere. Why is that happening?
I mean, that's not unusual when you think even for the Chinese, right? That we clearly have a larger percentage than the people who are speaking Mandarin. That's because we are taught, like my generation upwards, even though you're ethnically Chinese, you speak English in school, you speak English at home. And so what is lost is your ability to then converse in either your own dialectal language or even the mainstream chosen, say, Mandarin language. So I'm fortunate I can still speak dialect because I grew up in a home where we spoke dialect to our grandparents and parents. But my children, they don't. So they've lost that.
Exactly. I also see that with my daughter. She's not that comfortable in Hindi the way she should have been. So I think that is a loss that I don't know what's going to happen. Are we going to lose? Because does culture also get affected because language goes, what other things get affected?
That's right.
But little clarification on the Hofstede model, you said that Singaporeans are comfortable with uncertainty. Are they comfortable with uncertainty? That's what you said in your slide, that they're comfortable with uncertainty.
Well, that's what the data shows, right? When you look at Hofstede's research. I think that it's really difficult when you think about Singaporeans as characterized by the dimensions, because there are two distortions I think that one can look at. The dimensions look generally at the Singaporean animal, if you can caricature and characterize. But within that caricature, you find that there are so many different fragments of a Singapore person that may not fit the mold so nicely, depending on how traveled you are, what's your educational level, what sort of work you do. So I totally get what you're saying, and I often question myself too on whether those characteristics in the dimensions are fully accurate. But I take that as a starting point. And then one has to then drill down and say, look, the person who is coming for mediation, even if he's a Singaporean, does he have dual citizenship? Where does he usually live? He may not even live in Singapore. What sort of companies he work for? How widely is he travel? What sort of company is it a US company, a Canadian, UK, European company, and all those sorts of factors?
Because the way I've looked at Singaporeans, I would really think that they will be very uncomfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity.
You're
Very.
right. Well, uncertainties, I think, make us uncomfortable, and that's why a lot of our forward planning deals with uncertainties. Our structures, our institutions are designed to look long-term rather than short-term. So I agree with you.
Yeah, but that part of it, I think you might need to, because the moment I saw it, I was like, Singaporeans comfortable with uncertainty? I really
Well,
couldn't
I
get my
think
hands
the
on
way I
it.
understand it is comfortable with uncertainty in the sense that we devise ways to manage those uncertainties. I think that's how I look at that.
Maybe, yeah. Little clarification also that there are 55 countries who have signed the Singapore Convention. Australia signed it on 10th September.
Correct. So
Yeah.
after that slide was on the 4th of
12th, 12th
September.
September. You mentioned 12th September.
Yeah, 12 is it. So after that, I think Australia signed. In fact, right on the dot of the Singapore Convention Week, I still remember having a talk with my friend Mary Walker. And immediately after we had that discussion with Gary Binberg and Mary Walker, that same evening, I think she announced that Australia has just
Oh, I'll tell you
signed.
why I have to be pointing it out, because you look, I'm just putting you in the Singaporean, and I should not. I mean, but I expect you to be so perfect, so perfect. I like to point out this when I can actually point something out, that 12th September slide, 10th September Australia signed it. How can Lim get it wrong? I'm trying to
Yeah.
get it wrong. It's a bit of a problem. The other thing, I don't know, everywhere it says that 7 countries have ratified it. According to me, Turkey has ratified it. Turkey believes they've ratified it, but
Mm.
UNCITRAL doesn't put it up. I can't. I to understand this one. I really can't understand. I've been saying, I put out posts also saying that 8 countries have ratified it. Because if a
Yeah.
country says that we've ratified it, who is anyone else to tell them that you haven't ratified it? they
That's
are
interesting.
they
Yeah.
want to have enforce it, but no, we say you can't enforce it because we think you haven't. So I just find that a little thing. Look, there are other things which I would get into, but most importantly, finally, is there a culture of mediation in Singapore? People, do they understand mediation, or are they still confused about it in all these years? What do you feel?
Um, I think it's work in progress. I feel we've come a long way since, the 2002 speech by the then Chief Justice. That's almost 19 years since. My own personal journey has convinced me that we've come a long way. The initial years were not so easy. Lawyers resisted, felt that it was going to take away their bread and butter. I think that piece have by and large come and gone. Lawyers are now very comfortable finding spaces to be of use in mediation so that they can continue to be helpful and to earn their fees. Mediators are starting to find pockets of work where they can actively be involved and also earn a good remuneration. But like I said, I think it's really more of the end of the beginning stage, and maybe now we're starting to get into the start of, one could say, stage 2 of our Singapore development in the mediation journey. And I'm really looking forward, because with the Singapore Convention as part of our backdrop, and the new rules coming on board in the beginning of either end of this year, beginning of next year, I think there's lots more stories to tell come next year, on how this is going to propel at least my region, maybe with Singapore as some kind of a focal point into what mediation might look like in the next 5 to 10 years.
Because the good thing that Singapore has done is this good branding, that Singapore and Singapore Convention are connected to each other. So a lot of people, I'm telling you, people really feel that Singapore is something about Singapore, not knowing why is
No,
it just named Singapore Convention, but the good branding has been done. I like the
it's,
marketing exercises.
I agree. It's a good branding, but I think we need to be careful. We don't own, I feel that, if we are not careful, and I say this to my Singaporean colleagues, if we are not careful, we'll come across maybe as being a little bit too arrogant for other people. we come across believing that we own the Singapore Convention, which is absolutely not true, of course. It's useful if we regard the Singapore Convention, the naming rights, as a good platform to project our success story with humility and invite other countries to come along and share their experiences so that together we can journey together.
Yeah, we
That
should
would,
not.
I
Yeah,
think,
yeah. People should not feel that there is something about enforceability only in Singapore.
no,
They should
for
not get that
sure.
connection somewhere because the larger thing will be lost in that
Yes, I
maybe.
totally agree with you.
But you look at the Singapore Convention one also because you'll be doing cross-border work. I look at it from the perspective that a domestic law will be drafted because of this, and
Yes.
that domestic law will at least. I'm not in favor of any regulating mediation as such in terms of qualifications and all that, but confidentiality without prejudice, mediator not being called as a witness, which we already have. Our law
Mm,
is the best in the world, I say. So we
mm,
already have that, but no one knows about it. That's the best kept secret in this country. That
mm.
25 years you've had the best law in the world on mediation. They say it's called conciliation. I say just look at the definition of the Singapore Convention. Does it fit into that definition? Yes. Then how do you say that you don't have a law on mediation? So that
Yeah,
whole confusion that is being created there. But I'm just saying that institutional work that like what you are doing is a very, very small aspect of mediation that has to happen. I mean,
I
there is
agree.
so because
I
numbers,
agree.
when I see the numbers of institutions, I see, I mean, this is the only thing which is discussed in terms of mediation. So I think maybe there also things are going a little wrong, but people think mediation is in the courts or these institutions do it. We are not connected with mediation as such. I mean, I want that signal to go down and
Mm,
let's see
mm.
how it happens. But you've given a lot of time. I'm really happy about that. I'm taking so much time of yours, but it's really nice. Like I said, pleasure listening to you, and I'm sure everyone has the same thing, and hopefully they will do it. But give me 1 second. I want to just because you are there and people will listen to you, just let them. I just want to take them through the website to tell them
Sure.
that the link to all. Okay, there is other parts of the website. Join me on what I'm doing, support me, schedule of what I do. I'm not getting into that. They can have a look at this, Peacemakers and Mediators Collective. But important thing is this schedule.
Mm,
That in Symposium, everyone's details are there. You just open this, you get who the person. You can click here straight for the link, go straight to the recording. You can read about the person here. I will show you Tat Lim's already up there. We are very, very efficient. I'm the most efficient
mm.
person in this world. I keep saying that. So please, please go click link. All of them are good speakers. Everyone has given their perspective. So now we have what 84. Your number 84, I think now. Yes,
Mm.
84. Yes, 84. So Tat Lim's recording is here. Click here. You're already watching it, but I'm just telling you that please do this. There is at the end, there is a YouTube channel thing, all the episodes of Evolution of a Mediator, which Tat has come on, and Ken Cloke has done 4 episodes and all. Please watch it. There's another show called In Conversation with a Beautiful Mind. Very
Wow.
nice
Yeah.
people from all over the world. Very nice people. I mean, like I said, they're all wonderful people. The whole idea is to put them out. So this is there. The last one happened last Saturday from Canada. So please have a look at all this. There is so much content. Just watch people from all over the world that they are wonderful people. And that's what I'm trying to do. They're all special people, mediators,
Yeah.
with the mediator mindset. And I want that to be out there being totally a mediator, nothing else, no litigation, no arbitration. Please, that you'd owe this to the world.
You're very
So,
kind.
so
And
thank you.
you're very wonderful. Thank you so much, Vikram, for this lovely opportunity. Saturday morning, afternoon
Uh,
here now, but well worth spending this time together.
well, thank you very much. Thank you. Am I still on screen share? Am I still on screen share?
Yes, you're still on screen share.
Why am I not being able to close it down? Because it still shows me new share, but I'm still not. For whatever reason that's happened, and it should not have happened. I'm still showing. Okay, I still that button has gone down. The problem is I put it down because I couldn't see the top of the thing. So anyway, thank you very much, Dad. And the lecture series you have to whenever you have time, because we'll start with what we'll go with the basics of mediation. Take our
Mm,
time because I want to make a playlist of what I will call mediation training, because I didn't want to use training. I said people with a mediator mindset don't need training, but
mm,
I'm putting it down there because this 40 hour and all keep people talking about. I
mm,
wanted to put tens and hundreds of hours there of
mm,
the best in the world. Let
mm,
people, because the mediator is not getting anything, they're only paying for
mm,
training and everything. I don't
mm.
want them to do that. like I said, they're special people. They want people should also relate to it and take it up as a profession.
Yeah, agree.